I'm really sorry. I feel like I'm dressing.
I don't want to see that.
You know, when I first started out in youth ministry decades ago, one of the things that I learned how to do, so when I first started college, this is me getting ready to talk, so you get a little bit of me winding down. When I first started college, way back when, I went to junior college to play football, but I was a music major. It seems like an odd combination. So I had grown up in my formative years playing the trumpet. Anybody here ever played a trumpet? Yeah, Jack's a master, I hear. And so I got there, but it was also that time in my life where I was starting to get serious about my faith. I started college when I was 17 years old, and when I was 18, you can say it in a number of different ways, but I became convinced that God wanted to use me in some fashion. And I thought from the very beginning it might be youth ministry, because that was the job that I had. I worked in a boys' club, and I loved being around kids and so forth. But one of the first things you had to learn back in the early 70s, which was right at the heart of the Jesus movement, check your history books, music in the church started to change. Before that time, you sang in church with a piano and an organ and maybe a choir, and you had books that were in the back of the seats in front of you, and you turned to page 512 and you sang. But I was listening and learning about other things that were happening in the church worldwide, and one of the things that was such a huge part of that was music. Modern rock music started to work its way into the church. We would have never had what we sang up here this morning if what happened in the 70s hadn't happened in the 70s. But I was at a crossroads because I knew I wanted to lead kids singing, but it's pretty hard to lead singing with a trumpet when all the kids are sitting around a campfire. And so I taught myself how to play the guitar. And so I have played guitar for about 50 years, but the only thing that I do very well in playing the guitar is with children, and sometimes with you guys your age. But children, singing with kids, it may be my first love. And so that's why I was late today. I stayed too long singing a song. So there you go. Okay. Remember that this series that Kyle and I are doing as we alternate is about prayer. It's about the holy ground. It's about approaching a holy, magnificent creator of the universe. And you know, after all of these years, it still blows me away to think that we can attempt to do that, to speak to him, and that we have the audacity to believe that he hears each one of us. In my formative years, when I was trying to decide, and it was in my early college years, was my childlike faith in a God who heard my prayers and billions of other prayers at the same time, that I just took by faith that God could do that. did I really believe that? And that's a moment in our lives as we grow older that we have to decide. There are things that we take at face value at a young age and never question them. And as we get older, we start to question. And there are some who persevere through that, and there are others who get lost in the maze of intellect and our feelings and modern culture and history, and it becomes a stumbling block. So I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes today about maybe the most basic thing that I could share with you, that maybe it will be helpful. At least that's what I hope. But remember, I'm talking about prayer today, but I'm going to talk about something else, but I'm really talking about prayer. So listen carefully. A few years ago here, we did kind of a deep dive on a couple of Sundays into the parable of the mustard seed. Some of you might remember it because it had a really creepy looking picture that I put up on the screen. It looked better small than it did big, and so I had to defend that. Anyway, I started thinking about the mustard seed again this week. I'm doing a lot of thinking these days. Most of us don't know much of anything about mustard seeds. Mustard seeds are these tiny little dots that are not much bigger than a piece of coarse ground pepper. It's about how big they are. You can put one in your hand and sometimes you wouldn't even see it. It's that small. Usually the mustard seed plant grows as like clumps of bushes all together. I don't know if you've ever seen a mustard seed bush. They ordinarily grow to be about 3 to 5 feet high. They're not huge trees, not at all. But in the right conditions, wild mustard seeds can grow together. They just sort of begin to clump together, and they would look like a huge tree. Sometimes 15 to 20 feet high. And Jesus uses this seed, the mustard seed, as a metaphor, as a word picture for explaining heaven when he talks to people and he tells them a story. Now, is this all he said? I don't know. Sometimes I think that we just get the highlights of some of his messages that are written in the Bible. But certainly this is the most important part, I think. It's in Matthew chapter 13. Very short parable. He put another parable before them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field." That means put it in the ground so it would grow. It is the smallest of seeds. But when it has grown, it is larger than all the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. Okay. Interpreting the Bible, opening up the Bible and looking at it, is unlike looking or studying most every other book. Although if we look at it historically, older books, ancient texts, you have to kind of project yourself back into those times to understand what is being said. This is a first century illustration. It is entirely acceptable if you look at this illustration, you could say, I don't get it. And so we try to do our best to explain something that people in the first century would have understood immediately to people in the 21st century who most have never even seen a mustard bush at all. He uses this as a first century illustration about the kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven, as Jesus was teaching it to his followers. It was this new, brand new interpretation of the times. A new picture for people who are listening in the first century. Many who had heard it passed down through the ages from generation to generation to generation as they talked about the God of heaven. And Jesus comes along and he was going to radically redefine how people could relate to God, how people could get in touch with the kingdom of heaven. Do you get this? You know, God's people, the Israelites, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, had related to God in a particular way. He was their God. They were his people. They had strange laws and customs. They behaved differently than the others in the Roman Empire. We sang a song next door about the Pharaoh and Moses. Yeah. And how the Pharaoh was the Egyptian king who didn't understand God's people, their customs and their ways, and so he was threatened by them. And he put him in captivity to show his power. Jesus comes along in the first century and says, I'm going to teach you something new. They understood kingdom. We don't understand kingdom. We read about it in textbooks, but as people, we have not grown up in a kingdom with a king. They understood kings and kingdoms and what kings could do and how kingdoms were supposed to operate. They lived in a kingdom under Roman rule. And they also lived with mustard seed bushes all around them. So when Jesus told them this parable, I think they understood immediately. 2,000 years later, it's a little harder. At another time, Jesus used the mustard seed as an illustration. He said the mustard seed, he connected it to this tiny seed to the size of faith. It's where we get the familiar phrase, faith of a mustard seed. That was Jesus connecting it for them. And even though the story of a mustard seed was culturally relevant to the people that listened, I would imagine that this illustration, this metaphor, this picture story that Jesus was using probably shocked the people hearing it for the first time. You see, for hundreds of years, the Israelites were looking forward to a king that would come and rule over them and rule over everybody else. This idea of a coming king and a coming kingdom was not foreign to them. They had been waiting for hundreds of years. They had been listening to little snippets of the story that we look back and we go, oh, that's prophecy, telling about stuff beforehand. They were hearing it live. They were watching it unfold before their eyes. They were expecting a kingdom. But they were also expecting a conquering king. The Pharaoh and the others who had imprisoned and beaten in war for so many years, they were expecting somebody who was going to come and pay them all back. They were human. That's what they expected. No matter what the prophet said, they were still in the back of their minds going, For all of these years, we have been kicked. We have been beaten. We have been the lowest of the low. When this new king comes, he's going to reign, and we're going to be his family. And so right here in this story, Jesus is comparing his kingdom to that. A single mustard seed. The tiniest of seeds. We have the ability to look back in time and see things that happened that they were seeing as it unfolded in real time. So yeah, we can pause and we can look back and we can interpret things that happen. And for us, we can look at this, the truth of this parable. When you think back over what God had done in the lives of the Israelites as well as in the rest of the world. King Jesus didn't enter the world in a purple robe, on a red carpet, surrounded by blaring trumpets. No, how did he come into the world? He came into a world as a nondescript little baby who didn't even have a home, with parents who didn't know what they were doing at all. He came as a baby, but he also came as a rebel in the womb of a young, insignificant girl. That's the story we can look back on and see. They didn't know it then. His first followers were not influential. They were not respected. They were a dozen working class men and some women who were there because in that culture they devalued women so much so that the women had to kind of sneak around and be with the men as Jesus was teaching. But he had this little band of people who absolutely refused to live by cultural expectations. His closest friends were society's rejects. You can't miss this. This is so important to the story of Jesus. Jesus would challenge everything that the empire stood for. And he lived as the antithesis, the total opposite of the Caesar, who ruled over all. And Jesus had the audacity to say, or at least to infer early on, that he was the new sheriff in town, that he was the new king. Oh my goodness. The storyline, you couldn't write this. This is such an amazing story. His greatest sermon that was recorded for us to read, it was a sermon of humility and simplicity and trust and love. Not power, his boldest statement that he ever made came by being nailed to a cross. In humiliation and in rejection, and even in that moment, as his followers had been with him for nearly 3 years, they walked away dejected. They didn't know what was going to happen in just a few hours after he was nailed to the cross. Even though he had told them, they didn't believe it. Well, who would believe it? The story is preposterous. The Jesus movement, the original Jesus movement, it didn't begin with an orchestrated launch with lots of promo telling people what was going to happen. It began with maybe 100 or 120 people, slightly more than the people in this room. Can you imagine us, this group right here? Look, I know most of you, none of us are very significant. Okay, I mean, let's be honest. Okay? There are no would-be kings and princes and princesses here. We are just common folks. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if this group of people said, we're going to overthrow America? We're going to overthrow it. Us. This group. It may take a few thousand years, but we're going to begin a rebel movement that is totally different in the empire than the regime. Isn't that crazy to think about it? And that's what Jesus was leading. Kingdom seeds are not big. Kingdom seeds are not even small. Kingdom seeds are extraordinarily small. What a strange way to talk about something so important, and yet Jesus did it. What this story of the mustard seed means to me is that when it comes to issues of Jesus' kingdom, we need to be careful to keep things like size and influence in perspective. Okay? You got that? We need to keep that all in perspective. Here's reality. Tiny mustard seeds grow up into clumps of bushes that occasionally get bigger. That's what a mustard seed does. If all of the environment is right, that could happen. But we are often people who become churches who get infatuated with stature and reputation and importance and leverage and power instead of the character and humility of our leader. We get sidetracked. We get a taste of certain things, and those things taste good. Most days anymore, I've said this the past few times I've spoken up here, and I guess you'll just have to bear with me. Most days anymore, I feel sometimes like I am being crushed by the power grab and the mingling of church life and politics happening all around us. I'm not saying it's not important, but there's something deeper at the core of humanity that causes us to grab for power. And it shouldn't be. Kingdom efforts are not crusades and demonstrations. You know what they are? They are small seeds. That's what they are. They are the conversations we have with people. And the practical day-to-day steps of obedience in acts of kindness and compassion that Jesus would do in that very moment. That's mustard seed life. Maybe the mustard seeds of faith should even be our prayers. That's what I connected this week. That means the true activities of the kingdom of Jesus will often look and feel small when they are done right. And maybe that's the way it should be. Does it ever feel to you like the world is caving in? There are definitely signs of decay and darkness all around us. It's been growing for hundreds of years here. We see it vividly. Life, as those of us who are coming closer to the end of our time here, we have perspective. We can see things that happened years ago that are not the way they used to be. And if you get a group of us sitting around in a circle, we talk about it. We gripe about it. People these days, even followers of Jesus, can be discouraged and angry. For so many, joy is harder and harder to find, and hope even more distant. So what kind of bunch of average people, nondescript people, what can the little rebel force do in the face of deep discouragement or difficulty that doesn't see an answer? Big problems need big fixes, right? No, not always. True kingdom seeds are often tiny beginnings of unexpected kingdom influence that every one of the rebels can do. Everybody can take part in it. If you were part of the rebel force that Jesus started a couple of thousand years ago, you've got something to do every day, every moment. So what does this have to do with prayer? We often carry around really foolish ideas that God is going to be impressed by the length and breadth of our prayers. Or sometimes, if we are in a group, sometimes we begin to think that people will look at us as more spiritual the longer our prayers go. Look, I have had the privilege of traveling to a number of other countries, usually going into some of the poorer areas to do church work and so forth. And I have been in front of crowds that double or triple this size. I've not done it for thousands, but for hundreds and hundreds. And I stand up in front and I speak, and then it is my time to pray. And so I will pray at the conclusion of speaking, or I will be asked to come up and pray on behalf of the group. And I pray the way I normally do. And I have had pastors in other countries look at me when I said amen, and they go, "Is that all you got?" And I go, "What do you mean?" And they just look at me and go, "That was a really short prayer. Maybe you ought to keep going." Imagine being in that spot. But that just isn't true. Not in real life, not in the Bible. Maybe it's time to start thinking about mustard seed kinds of prayers. It's okay to think quality and not necessarily quantity. Let me just show you something. The tax collector, seeing the mess of his life, could only pray this prayer. That's it. "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner." Can you imagine if that was the extent of your prayer for an entire day? That's all you prayed. Everywhere you went, before every meal you ate, before every interaction with somebody, whenever that really crummy thought comes into your mind or anger begins to grab your heart, what if your prayer was simply, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner"? Now, I don't know what that would do for the overall kingdom, but I know what that would do for my heart to pray that all day long. Do you think perspective would change about you, about God, about your situation? Of course it would. That takes some discipline to pray that kind of mustard seed prayer. It isn't very long. There's another time that a young mother was filled to the brim with despair over her sick daughter, and she could only pray this prayer. Ever been there? You know what most of us have learned to do? We say, "Lord, help me," and "Lord, let me explain to you the very things that I need and how it could help me." So do you have a notepad, God? Because I'm going to tell you all the things that need to happen. That's how we pray. Instead of just saying again and again and again, "Lord, help me." You know what this does? It puts you in the proper place, and it puts God in the proper place. That's it. Do you remember this? The thief, one of the thieves on the cross, as Jesus was crucified in the middle, and there's one on either side. The one says to him, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." You know what most of us have been led to believe is that when we have that moment before Jesus, as we are getting ready to pass through the pearly gates of heaven, whatever that's going to look like, we want to have our iPad. Because when we say, "Jesus, remember me in your kingdom," can I remind you of all the things that I did that make me memorable? Conveniently leaving out the bad stuff. Look, it feels a little awkward today for me. I mean, I'm the one that stands up here speaking. It actually feels slightly hypocritical to be up here talking about the significance and power of short, honest prayers when I'm the guy that's expected to pray. In my early years of Bible college and seminary, they taught us about what was called in most churches the pastoral prayer. That moment in the service when you as the pastor are to stand up in front and pray over the flock that you are the shepherd of, to pray pastorally, to pray priestly, to pray about all of those amazing things that God could do. I was supposed to do that out loud, publicly. I got to tell you, it seems so funny to look back on, there was enormous pressure as a young pastor that expected me to do those things, that expected me to identify and interpret theology in my prayers for people, as I am talking to God, who already knows all of that. And so it took years and years and years for me to grow out of that and to realize that even when I did a pastoral prayer of some kind over a group of people, I wasn't talking to them. I was just talking to God. Some of you, I'm going to tell a secret. Some of you have heard me get up in front and pray at times. I pray a lot out loud. I pray an awful lot like I speak. There are long pauses in my prayers when I'm doing it publicly as I think what I'm going to say, and am I saying that for people sitting there, or am I actually saying stuff to God that I want him to hear from me? And so there's a lot of stopping and starting and clearing my throat, and in my head I'm going, that is a really stupid thing to say to God. Now, does God forgive me? Of course he does. Does he forgive you when you mess up? Of course he does. He doesn't care about the eloquence of your prayers out loud. He's not keeping track of that. But the reality is, I had to learn something new. I had all the right prayer words and phrases so that the prayer would be heard. And the reality was, sometimes I would get up in front of people and words would come out of my head and my mouth because they were supposed to, but all my heart had to give was something shorter, way shorter, like mustard seed short. So take this with you today. It's kind of an unexpected little package in a parable that Jesus gave about the kingdom. Maybe we just learn to keep praying small prayers and having simple conversations, honest conversations with God, and sometimes with the people around us when it seems right to pray together. Maybe what prayers are for people listening is just planting modest seeds of love and compassion everywhere we go. Because that's what rebels do in the new kingdom. The new kingdom way, which is not so new for us, it's 2,000 years old. What I would suggest is that we begin to reclaim some of the foundations of the early rebellion in the midst of the Roman Empire, in the midst of something so big they didn't know what to do. Sometimes I feel that way. Here's what we need to do. We just need to continue to live lives of trust. Because kingdom growth is always in the hands of the king. And we can never diminish the value of seeds being sown. whether it is words of encouragement or simple, honest prayers to God, however insignificant they may seem in our own eyes. You know, it's pretty incredible to think that the full and total kingship of Jesus was established by way of an event in history that was designed to completely strip him of his significance, to strip him of his reputation, to strip him not of his clothes, but to strip him of his power by subjecting him to the most heinous and degrading death the Roman Empire could inflict on a person. That was our king. But remember this, from the cowardice of dark and small human hearts, the death and resurrection of Jesus gave rise to a kingdom unlike any others, unlike anything that human history has ever seen or ever will see. And you knew this was going to come here today. We remember that every week when we take the juice and the bread of communion. It's what we do here every Sunday. We share that together to remind each other that that little act of taking juice and eating bread changes us and draws us together with the other rebels who are living out kingdom values in a world with mustard seed kinds of steps and prayers. Remember that as you take communion. You guys are going to go and serve. These guys are going to walk by you. If you're new here today, these guys will pass the communion trays around. You can take one. The cups are stacked on top of each other. And take it and pause. There's some words of encouragement up here on the screen, Bible verses, a couple of quotes, and some prayers. Read them. Have a moment here with your King.